Hello, welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm Claudia Rizzini and I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute. Today we're hearing from Joe Roman, a conservation biologist specializing in endangered species and marine ecology. Joe has had a wide range of research interests, exploring marine mammals, biodiversity and human health, marine policy, and invasive species. Usually, Joe is a researcher and writer at the University of Vermont. He has published numerous scientific and popular articles. His first book, Whale, traces the history of cetaceans in marine ecosystems, as well as chronicling the impact of whales on human culture and economy. Joe's second book, Listed, traces the history and impact of America's Endangered Species Act of 1973. Joe was born in Queens and grew up on Long Island. Much of his work is on island ecosystems, spanning from Alaska to Hawaii to Iceland. He has worked in Cuba for almost a decade, and his lifelong dream is to convert Guantanamo Naval Base and Detention Center into an international peace park focused on biodiversity, conservation, and climate change, kind of a Woodhull of the Caribbean. In his time at Radcliffe, Joe is nearing the completion of his third book, titled Eat, Poop, Die: How Animals Make Our World, slated for release in November. The book traces the movement of nutrients by animals across the globe. During today's talk, he'll discuss the book and related research he has done on great whales. While working on his PhD in organismic and evolutionary biology here at Harvard, Joe found a way to combine his passions of gastronomy and marine conservation. He founded Eat the Invaders, a website dedicated to controlling invasive species by eating them. If you're looking for a gateway invasive, he suggests trying barbecued lionfish, a carnivorous non-native fish in the North Atlantic. It is a great pleasure to welcome Joe Roman to the podium.
Great to see you all. Thank you, Claudia, for that introduction. A couple of years ago, someone introduced me as having gotten my PhD in orgasmic and revolutionary biology. And I have been looking for that department ever since. But, well, you nicely navigated there. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to first off thank the Radcliffe staff for what's truly been one of my best years during my career, especially Claudia and Jen and Elizabeth and Sharon and Kyla, Maria, Allison, and someone I think all of us see every day, Margarita, who keeps the building clean and is always so friendly and thoughtful. So, and I also want to thank all of you, my amazing fellows. When my daughter first met some of you, she whispered in my ear, "Why did they pick you?" And I feel that every day. I don't know how I got to be so lucky to be with this crowd, but thank you guys. And also want to thank my research partner, Emma McKenzie, right there. She found some great quotes and really helped enhance the book, and has so far saved me from at least 10 blunders that were going to enter into that book. So thank you, Emma, and it's just been a great year to work with you. Heads up today that this is going to be a rough cut. I submitted a draft of the book about 2 weeks ago, and oh, thank you. That's very nice. I've been adding things, and I chatted with Asfa about maybe, she suggested you could just do your greatest hits tour and do all my whale stuff, but I'm actually going to add some new things that I haven't tried before. So we'll see how it goes. So November 14th, 1963, there was an eruption off the coast of southern Iceland. This is the eruption column. It went about a couple of miles into the sky. The eruption occurred in the ocean about 400 feet below the surface. And I'm going to apologize. I've been writing this book for a trade audience, so the numbers I have in my head are American. So I'll apologize to my scientific colleagues that sometimes I'll use feet, sometimes I'll use meters, whichever numbers come to mind. It was first observed by a fishing boat off the coast, and I actually have a short film strip that was done in the 1960s. It was produced in 1967, so they're going to use the date 67, but the eruption was actually in 63.
On the 5th of June, 1967, the volcanic activity off the south coast of Iceland, known as the Surtsey eruption, came to an end. This eruption went on for 3.5 years and was not lacking in variety while it lasted. The first visible activity began on the 14th of November, 1963, an explosive eruption that continued most of the winter. It was very powerful at times, though on occasions there were pauses for a while.
And this is what it looked like the following year. So at this point, the island was growing about 25 square meters per second, or the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza every day. Right? So it became this enormous island in just about 3 years when the volcanic activity ceased. And this is what Surtsey Island, which is what they called it, looks like now. I visited this island in 2021. This year is going to be its 60th year on the planet. So a lot of researchers that work there are actually older than the island itself. I was lucky enough to join the researchers. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in part because it's been so well protected. So there's been studying the ecology from day one, and there aren't many places on the world where you have basically a blank slate and you can see how ecosystems evolve, and that's really what brought me there. Two of the stars of the show are Fulmars and guillemots. These are the first two birds that were born on the island in 1970, and then that's a Fulmar. These are seabirds, so they're feeding from the ocean and then they're breeding on land, and this unites into the work that I've been doing, which is how do animals move nutrients around? Does it matter? If it matters, how? Right? So how can this movement change ecosystems? So this is what Surtsey would have looked like 50 years ago, and still looks like in a large part of the island now. A few maritime plants. How do they survive? They have large seeds. They float in on the ocean. They bring in nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, in these systems, phosphorus is pretty common in volcanic rock in young areas, but nitrogen is pretty rare. Just like you have to fertilize your garden, they need nitrogen in order for the DNA the plants do, or for chloroplasts, or all the activities that any other organism would. So it was just those plants that arrived floating in that had that nitrogen that could survive. Things started to change in the 1980s, though. Gulls arrived, herring gulls, blackback gulls, kittiwakes, and they were bringing in about 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre to these areas. So they're bringing in all these nutrients into that system. That's comparable to a managed pasture, how much fertilizer people would put out in pasture. So what happened? This is what the breeding bird area looks like now. So compare that to what it would have been before and after. The entire ecosystem changed in that system. And this is, those of us who work in ecology, as one of my colleagues said, ecology isn't rocket science, it's a lot harder. We're often looking at really complex systems. Here's one where we know where every individual, every species arrived at what time, and have an idea of what the impact is. In the beginning, the scientists that worked there knew pretty much every plant that was there individually. They had a number and they had a stake in there. You can see this change from space. So this is Surtsey, taken a couple of years. Actually, this is from Google Earth. I just took a screenshot, so it's very recent. But you can see that green area there. That's where the seabirds are. And you can barely see it, but there's some green at the top there too, and seals have started breeding there as well, and they're also bringing those nutrients. So this system that was nutrient limited for 10 years, and for 15 years, and now is that these areas are starting to grow, and as there's a positive feedback loop. As the breeding areas get larger, more birds come in, and you can see this ripple effect, so that you see this expand over time. Here's one of the illustrations of the book to give you a timeline of how this happened. The sea rocket and the sea sandwort, or those, as the name implies, those are the maritime plants that come in with their own nutrients, they survive. Not many new species come in until 1985. The lesser blackback gull and those other gulls come in, and that's when those nutrients come in. And now you get these meadow grasses. As one scientist said, you could probably graze cows out there now. It's so deep and so rich and thick. Luckily, those areas are protected. And as one of the other biologists said, in the future, it'll probably be the land of the puffin. If any of you have been to Iceland, those are, I think it maybe half the world's or maybe more of the world's puffins breed along the southern part of Iceland. So that's the future. So to give you an idea of why this matters, let's look at movement on a larger scale. How animals are actually traveling around the world every day. This is from MoveBank, and these are from GPS collars from different animals that have been recorded. So we're seeing now up top, I think it's April, and we're going to just see change over time. It's coming into summer, so you're seeing animals move north in the northern hemisphere. This is everything from whales to seabirds to mammals and how they're moving around these areas. It made me think, and I'm not the first one to come up with this idea, Chris Dowdy, one of my colleagues, call animals like the circulatory system of the planet. We're familiar that plants are the lungs of the planet, but animals are moving around and they're moving these nutrients, whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus, other nutrients, and they're also acting in different ways, having different impacts on ecosystems, not only by moving, they can move nutrients through their poop, which we saw through the seabirds, but also through their carcasses, and I'll show you a couple of the largest carcasses ever on the planet and how that can have an impact on the deep sea. And they're also influencing systems by feeding there, right? So if they're actually grazing, that can change how ecosystems form. But all this movement comes at a risk. So with great whales, and when I say great whales, that includes all the baleen whales, they're filter feeders, as well as sperm whales. So it's basically just a size, it's not an evolutionary term. On January 29th, 2019, a 37-foot male whale stranded in Everglades National Park. Scientists took it up onto the shore and did a necropsy of this. So it's basically like an autopsy, but an autopsy for animals. It indicated, again, that it was an adult male and that there were no external signs of trauma. So it hadn't been hit by a ship and hadn't been caught in fishing gear, two of the really big dangers here in the US. The DNA matched what is a Gulf of Mexico whale, which is the most recently described great whale found off the coast of Florida to Texas, critically endangered. In fact, it's the rarest whale on Earth. There are fewer than probably 50 individuals left on the planet. And it historically lived off the coast of the Mississippi River, which, if any of you have been in that area, there's lots of oil extraction, lots of noise, lots of activity. So they're not found there anymore. They're found in this relatively small pocket off the coast of Florida. It gets worse. So they didn't find any external trauma, but they found a piece of plastic in its stomach that was about the size of a credit card that it had swallowed. So the whale was emaciated, and cause of death was plastic. we face a really big hurdle here. We've done a good job historically of protecting whales from direct kills, from whaling, and basically from whaling, but this is going to be a major challenge for us going forward for these whales, and indeed for marine life in general, is how we're going to control that. As the crime writer Raymond Chandler said, though, all great crime stories are stories of redemption. And the good news is there is redemption in the history of marine mammal protection. I grew up in New York. I'm pretty cynical. I'm actually probably edged towards pessimism, but I've been lucky in that a lot of the species that I've studied, numbers have improved because of good, hard decisions that have been made. Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act were both passed about 50 years ago in 1972 and 1973, and many species have recovered since then. The eastern gray whale is one good example. That was endangered at the time that the law was passed. There were about 11,000. There are now, the numbers have probably gone down again. They hit about 27,000, and they have been removed from the Endangered Species Act. So they're no longer listed. They're considered recovered, which is the goal. Northern elephant seals might be one of the most inspirational changes. There were fewer elephant seals on the planet than are in this photo in the 1900s. So they had been hunted so heavily, there were probably only about 20 or 30 individuals on the planet. Conservation efforts between Mexico and the United States set in the early 1900s, and that continue today through the Marine Mammal Protection Act, have been incredibly effective. So there's about 180,000 individuals on the planet now, probably as many as there have ever been. And this shows you, if we set our minds to this, that we can really make a difference. And I love this photo. As Claudia said, I grew up in New York. I never saw a whale as a kid. And this blows my mind. I see whales now when I go home. And that is thanks to the Endangered Species Act, thanks to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but also the Clean Water Act. The water around New York was a mess then, and we were overfishing, so we protected the fisheries. So all four of those legislations resulted in some phenomenal changes that we can do across a generation or two. It's essential to keep these, but also think about how we can move forward on these ideas. About 2/3 of US marine mammals are now, the populations continue to increase, and that's a pattern we're also seeing around the world where global protections are. Given, again, the caveat that we still have critically endangered species. I'm not trying to ignore the fact that North Atlantic right whale, Gulf of Mexico whale, there's still a lot of work to do. So this is the background when I was when I was doing my master's degree, really, at the University of Florida in the 1990s. Not every country has been celebrating the changes, the return of a lot of these species. And two countries that have really been pushing back against it are Japan and Norway, also to a lesser degree Iceland and Canada. Said, well, what if we have too many whales? Maybe there are too many whales and they're competing with human fisheries. And of course, this was on the Japanese website until relatively, it may still be up. They also claim that as the smaller whales return, that can endanger the larger whales because they're eating the same food. Maybe there's even a conservation reason for hunting whales again. So that at least was in my mind in the 1990s. And then I learned about this concept called the biological pump. For those of you who study ocean systems, you'll be familiar with this. I was sitting in the back of the classroom, probably dozing off or, so sort of thinking about several different things. And then I saw this image. Larry McEdwards showed it during the marine ecology class. And it shows this very typical movement. Basically, of course, the photosynthesis only occurs at the surface of the ocean where there's enough light. And then through death and defecation, the phytoplankton and the zooplankton sink below. So that's the biological pump. Carbon is drawn down to the bottom. And I thought, there's actually something else that's not part of the system that I had been watching for a number of years when I had been out at sea, pretty much every time I was following whales. And a couple of years ago, we were insulating our attic, and I found my notes from that lecture. And basically, what I was thinking at the time was, when I watch whales, right whales is what I always study, they dive down, and they often get mud on their bonnets, so they're feeding all the way at the bottom of the ocean. They'll come up 100 meters or 200 meters, they rise to the surface, they breathe, they digest, they rest, and often just before they fluke again, they poop, and they release this enormous fecal plume. I thought, here's a way that's going the opposite of the biological pump, right? I mean, they're actually bringing something to the surface. And I was doing other things at that time, including, you could tell I was a graduate student because I had to remind myself to eat on the right there. And even at that time, I was thinking about, well, there are only like 400 right whales in the ocean right now. What about when there were 10,000, right? What about when they were much more numerous? I was fortunate enough when I came to Harvard to meet Jim McCarthy, who is a biological oceanographer, most of whom, when I discussed this idea, would kind of dismiss it. As one of my colleagues, Dick Barber, said, sure, there must be something in that fecal plume, but is it ecologically important or a fart in a hurricane? And that's really what I've been trying to answer now is, okay, well, how big is this, right? Does it actually matter? And Jim was willing to entertain that idea. So here's that biological pump on the left, and then this idea that we called the whale pump, that whales are feeding at depth, coming to the surface, and releasing feces and urea. And then we built a model to look at that here in the Gulf of Maine, so not far off the coast here, and found that whales, even now in their low numbers, bring as much nitrogen. This is the limiting nutrient in the system, just like at Surtsey in the northern hemisphere. When phytoplankton run out of nitrogen, then productivity goes down. So in the spring, lots of productivity, lots of nitrogen, and then they use up that nitrogen. And then the productivity, the primary productivity goes down. Whales are actually boosting that productivity by releasing nitrogen at the surface where the phytoplankton needs it, even more than all the rivers combined into the system. Not as much as atmospheric deposition. A lot of that comes through agriculture as well as through industrial activities. And about the same as coastal point source, which is human sewage. But whales are passing it, they're releasing it offshore into areas where they can have an impact, where they're feeding, and they can have an impact on these offshore areas. We submitted it to a high-end journal, and it was rejected. Anybody else scientists know that feeling, and it was disappointing. And but one of the reviewers said, "You guys, we were at Harvard. You guys are right at the coastline. Why are you just building a model? Why don't you go out and collect the samples?" And you're like, "Damn, all right, we got to start again." But they had a point, so we did. We started collecting whale fecal samples to see what's in it. That year, it was called by Popular Science one of the worst jobs in science by one of my colleagues. And it is a hard job because it's, if you follow an animal long enough, it will poop. But sometimes you can wait an entire day because it's hard to see where the feces is from a distance. You're low to the water. So my colleagues Roz Rolland and Scott Krause thought of an excellent tool to use, an excellent colleague. So they hired sniffer dogs. This is Fargo, which is was a 90-pound Rottweiler. He had worked as a companion animal to an elderly woman when she went into assisted living. He became a sniffer dog in prison system in Washington State, and then he got what I think must be a dream job. He became a wildlife detecting dog, right? Looking for everything from bear scats to puma scats, and eventually right whale poop. And unfortunately, he succumbed to seasickness, so he had a Dramamine before he went out every time, and his colleague, Bob, was terrified of whales, so we only had one field season there because he would cower in the bottom of the boat when a whale emerged. How does this work? Well, this you can see at sea. This is a scent cone. If any of you have watched a dog be on a scent on land, they're also going like this downwind. And that's challenging on land because you have hills, you have trees, so the scent can move. You don't have those challenges on the ocean, but of course you can't move, you can't run, so it's the boat driver that's moving up that scent cone. That when you see that filled in black box on the right, that's the first time he detects it. And Rottweilers have relatively small tails. They called it the happy inch when he was on that scent. And then you see him go upwind, he gets the X, and that means he's off it, so he settles down. He's not on the scent anymore, and eventually finds it. That circle is when humans can detect it. So he could detect it a nautical mile away. He could find these samples. Humans, we could smell at about 100 meters. It's a strong smell. And they would get about 2 to 3 times the amount of samples when the dog was on the boat than when it wasn't. The good news for us is, yes, there was a lot of nitrogen in that system, and yes, when we used that filtrate, it increased the productivity in those areas. So the time course experiments supported our expectations, and we've been working on this ever since. In case you were wondering what whale feces looks like, it has lots of variety. I like to compare it to snowflakes or something like that. Everyone is unique, and each has its own form of beauty. On the upper right is from a blue whale. They feed on krill. It tends to float and clump. On the lower left, you have a whale that's fed on fish, and that tends to be a lot harder to find because it's lower beneath the surface. A friend of mine, Dave Wiley, just sent me this, so this is hot off the press of the work that he just published, this article on a new technology that's been used to study whales. This is a fin whale off the coast of Mexico, and that's a drone up top. And this is a tag that they're going to put on this fin whale. You're going to see. So the drone drops it. This is a suction cup tag, so it's going to stick on the back. It won't harm the whale. And then you get to see what the whales are doing beneath the water. And when I started my career, everything we knew about a whale was pretty much what we saw. And then you realize that's the most trivial part of that animal's life, is when it's at the surface. Everything it's doing is below the surface. Whales also travel, so they're moving up and down, this whale pump idea. But what I've been working on the past couple of years is the movement of whales long distances. So they feed in high latitudes and they breed in low latitudes. So they're feeding in highly productive areas, let's say off Alaska, and breeding in warm, shallow areas, say off the coast of Hawaii, where I've studied them. So we think, remember when we started out, we're looking at that nutrient movement for seabirds. Well, what kind of movement when you have the largest animals that have ever existed on the planet moving the longest distances of any mammals, right? What does that mean for these low latitude ecosystems? I'm sure many of us have been in tropical systems. The water's clear, and that clarity is an indication of low productivity, so an indication that it's nutrient limited. So what my colleagues and I have been working on is this idea of a great whale conveyor belt, the movement of these nutrients from everywhere, from whether it could be Alaska or from Iceland or other systems. What does that mean for these low latitude systems? They're bringing a lot of biomass into these areas. Just into Hawaii alone, about 3,800 tons. Back of the envelope, I think that's 15 million Big Macs, to give you an idea, and I probably should do an impossible unit as well. It's an impossible burger unit as well at some point. These whales are moving these nutrients, and it also, the nitrogen and phosphorus has an impact on the plankton growth as well. I won't have time today to talk about that. And then I had mentioned, what about whale death? When whales die, they provide habitats in the deep sea for more than 100 species that have only been found on whale falls, so that are endemic to these areas. Think about it. These are like enormous islands that are sinking into the deep sea, which is nutrient poor and has very little habitat structure, and suddenly you have this enormous skeletons that are dropping into these systems. One of the unique systems is called Osedox, or a bone eater. It's a polychaete worm shown here. Doesn't have a mouth, doesn't have a gut, doesn't have an anus. It doesn't really fit into the eat, poop, die concept. Well, maybe the die part. But it's absorbing nutrients. It has a root system. And then it has not gut microbes, it has internal microbes, microbial symbionts inside that are producing the sugar. So it provides sulfides and other chemicals to the microbes within, and then they grow in the system. They can be there in the thousands on this system, up to 40,000 individuals just on one dead whale alone. I mentioned hunting, and my colleagues and I put together a paper a couple of years ago. This is mostly Craig Smith, based out of the University of Hawaii, who's been working on whale fall systems since they were first discovered. He was actually on the ship when Alvin first saw a remotely operated vehicle. Well, no, it's actually, there were people on that one. A deep sea submersible at that point, and they saw all this life on a dead whale and were shocked. When we were harvesting whales, we actually removed those habitats, and we think probably the earliest extinctions in the ocean might have occurred among these deep sea organisms before we even knew they existed. So it's important that we keep these whale populations high, and the larger they are, the more valuable they are to the system. So the fin whales and blue whales especially are very important. I've been working on this when I was at the University of Iceland a couple of years ago, and woke up as I did this morning to work on the talk, and I realized that at that point, well, this was the end of a Fulbright in Iceland, that my work could be summed up in 3, maybe 5 words, which is, this was humpback whales, but where they eat, how they poop, and how they die, and also it's pee as well. But that's really what brought me here, was that waking up that morning and getting that title. And I know a lot of us have spoken about process. For me, this project started with a title one morning, and I've been working for several years now, and then this is where it resulted this year. After I feel like I wish I could have spent more time with you guys than being cloistered in my office every day, but we're finally getting towards the end of that. So we've been talking about the the poop and the die part, but what about eating? So in this is a North Pacific sea otter, and they have a voracious appetite. So they eat about 25% of their body weight each day, right? So I think humans, maybe we do 2% or something like that. So they eat a lot, and that has a big impact on the ecosystems where they're found. Unfortunately, like whales, they were heavily harvested and reduced to about 1 or 2% of their historic populations. Their fur is amazing, and it was highly desirable in China, and Russians, Americans, and British especially hunted them very hard. The historical range is here in yellow, running from Mexico over to Japan. And they had been reduced in the 1970s, basically just to that area that's the circle in red there. This is going to be a good news story, ultimately. But that area where they were mostly found had been slated for the largest atomic test, hydrogen bomb test in 1971. It was scheduled. And there were luckily a few biologists, John Vanya being one, that had been wanting to translocate this one rare population back to the areas where it had been found. He was a state of Alaska biologist. This was before Alaska had oil. It was poor, underfunded, and when he heard that they were going to test this, he and others had an idea, well, maybe we could get the Atomic Energy Commission to fund moving these otters, because they were going to die. Many of them, thousands of them, were going to die after this blast from the pressure waves. And at that same time, there was a young environmental organization starting up, Greenpeace, which was protesting, which had been started to protest this particular bomb. So he went to the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, said, look, you're going to have a problem. You're going to see all these dead otters wash up. We have an answer. if you can fund us, we can help move these out. And so initially he asked for something small like radios or something, but this was the American military at the height of the Cold War. So he got these Hercules planes, he got all the support to help move these, and they moved, that's one of the otters in the cage there, more than 500 otters out of that area to Southeast Alaska, to Oregon, to British Columbia, areas where they had long been absent. This is what happened, so I'm going to show you what the impact on this. This was the largest underground test of a hydrogen bomb that the U.S. ever conducted. So it had a large impact on Amchitka and did end up killing at least several hundred, maybe a couple of thousand otters. But the ones that escaped, the descendants of those that were moved, still persist today. So there are now 50,000 approximate descendants of those otters that were moved out of Amchitka. Has anyone seen sea otters in the wild? Oh yeah, okay. They draw a big tourist industry, and they're quite curious, and they take over this area. It's really amazing. So this expansion ends up being incredibly successful. 1 out of every 3 sea otters in the entire North Pacific are now descendants of this Cannikin blast, of this work that folks at that point had been part of. Now, we're talking here about ecological impacts, extensive. When they move these otters have a very large impact on ocean ecosystems. Above, you can see what coastal systems look like when sea otters are present and when they're absent. That absence is called urchin barren. So sea urchins, when they're common, eat kelp. So they're eating all the macroalgae in that area. And the otters eat the sea urchins rather. So when the sea otters are there, urchin populations decline, and you get fewer and smaller sea urchins. The kelp forests get larger. Seagrass diversity changes as well. And this is also a nursery for kelp fish. So it changes the fisheries in those areas, and species diversity increases. Unfortunately, for people who fish in these areas, they really like benthic invertebrates. That is the invertebrates that live on the bottom of the ocean. So that does have an impact on everything from clams to crabs to crustaceans to urchins. So it has an impact. This image shows 0 is in the absence of otters. When otters come back, the direct catch of invertebrates goes down, but fish in those areas increase because they have this nursery. Carbon sequestration. Carbon is captured in this kelp. It's very fast growing. And when it dies, it can sink into the deep sea, so it can sequester or at least store carbon. And then it has a big impact on tourism. All right, sea otters are cute, and Izzy's traveling today. But that actually has a big impact on how we manage animals, is their cuteness. It matters what these animals look like. And we can see that in federal management programs. Most of the money in the Endangered Species Act goes towards mammals, birds, and things we eat. So they're either cute or we like to consume them. That's where we tend to put our money. Very little money in reptiles, invertebrates, or plants. Not even enough, so this is how much goes in endangered species protection for these groups. Not even enough really to write the reports, typically for plants or invertebrates. But mammals, birds, and fish we really care about. So I thought about, well, where does this bias come from? This was while I was working on my book Listed, so I looked in my daughter's toy chest to see if those biases were actually there from the beginning. And indeed, then I did a phylogenetic analysis of her animals in her toy chest and found indeed 21 of the animals were mammals, several birds, one plant, I think it was a tree, like some small tree, and there was an isopod there, probably because she's the daughter of a biologist, and we bought it from IKEA. So that made its way in. So there's something to this. But what I look at is the functional value of animals as well. I acknowledge that, and there are studies showing that charismatic animals matter too, and they can act as umbrella species for other animals. But what I think about is, well, what's the functional power? How do these animals matter to us, either in our homes or when we travel abroad, right? How many of you all have been on a tropical beach, say, in the past 3 years, or a subtropical beach? Many of us. And the source of that sand in places like Hawaii and the Caribbean is often parrotfish poop. So we are dependent in those systems. They're feeding on corals or on rocks, breaking it down in their guts, and then passing it out to the tune of 1,000 pounds a year, up to even some as much as 10,000 pounds per year in individual fish. So they're creating a lot of this sand in those areas. We depend on that. And that's incredibly valuable. And that's just one example of many of these species that are having this kind of impact across the world. Before I wrap up, I'll give you one reality check. So we have a lot of work to do. And one is, this was shocking to me when this paper came out a couple of years ago in, 2018. But on the planet right now, we humans are a third of the biomass of all mammals on the planet. This includes great whales or all the species we've been talking about, 4 mammals. And then about 2/3 of the biomass is cows, pigs, goats, and other mammals. Just 4% of mammals on the planet are wild at this point. And that's why it's no surprising to me that often people challenge that animals don't really matter. Because they don't matter because they're almost not, how often do we see wild animals in our everyday? And this is similar true for birds as well. 70% of bird life on the planet now by a biomass are chickens and ducks. And I think this is one of my life goals, is to try and move that number up a little bit. How do we get there, right? Well, one way is protecting what we have, and the other is this new effort of rewilding animals. So we chatted about the role of Cannakin and the atomic legacy, of which many are bad, but there are at least a couple of good wildlife legacies of atomic energy. Can we do something similar from the climate crisis and use that to motivate us to restore wild animals? And these are natural climate solutions. For example, wildebeests in Africa, when they eat the grasses there, they're controlling shrubs, and that's changing the ecosystem in those areas and sequestering more carbon. And that's true for many species, whether it's something as large as a whale or as small as a grasshopper. By restoring these animals, we have a shot at both confronting the diversity crisis, biodiversity crisis, as well as controlling carbon. So I'll leave you with a question: can we, as humans, replace our carbon footprint with the tracks of wild animals? Thank you. Thank you, guys.
So fascinating,
Oh, thank
absolutely
you.
fascinating.
I appreciate
So we have a few questions, but feel free to ask more. Let's see. Clearly, species conservation is critical. Do you think that this type of artificial control of species is sustainable? I mean, how many can we
Artificial,
save?
did you say? Or?
Artificial. Yeah, I mean, made by humans.
Oh, you mean domestic animals, or I'm not sure?
No,
I'm not
I mean, how can the artificial control of species, like, okay, we save the otter from one place, we put it, how is that sustainable? How we can save all species that way? I mean,
I see.
all endangered species.
I see. So by maybe we could talk about it as rather than artificial rewilding or moving or translocating species. We can do a lot that way, for sure. Will that solve the biodiversity crisis? Not alone. I think we need to learn, in addition to moving species back to areas where they were historically found, and maybe this is where the term artificial came in, climate change is going to change things. So the system is changing every day, right? The species I study, North Atlantic right whales, when I started that whale pump work, they were feeding off the coast of the Bay of Fundy, which is here, not too far away in the Gulf of Maine. They're now in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, so they've moved to an entirely different area, and that's put them at risk, new risks. So we're going to have to be both working on these historical areas, but also thinking about how temperatures are changing things. I believe we can get there. It's a matter of our choice whether we will, but I've seen enough cases where hard-fought protection efforts actually succeed. And I can't predict like what our future if it was true. So after the Pleistocene, 10,000 years ago, humans eradicated most of the large animals on the planet, most of the large herbivores, and replaced them with cows and replaced them with domestic animals. Can we imagine a time when we're reversing it? I can, and how can we get there?
Great. You talked about rewilding animals. Can you talk about some methods about how we do that?
Sure. So there are a couple of different ways, and I'll talk about the least controversial to maybe the most controversial. Least controversial is areas where they've been eradicated in the past 100 years or something like that, and animals that don't have large conflicts with humans. So otters seemed pretty easy, you move them there, but then they do conflict with fisheries. Something like elephants is going to be a challenge in Africa or in other places. There are going to be conflicts with moving species around. But if a species has been eradicated in the past 100 or 200 years, the ecosystems are relatively the same, and it can be relatively straightforward, and we've seen examples of that, whether it's bison are a good example in the United States. And here's a great example with bison is indigenous communities are welcoming them in. So you can start by moving them out of places, say like Yellowstone, moving them to local Indian lands, and then the dream is, and they've been working as a coalition, trying to restore the migration of these species. So again, that nutrient movement. So that's the easy way. Harder ones are species that have been gone for thousands of years. And then you get pushback from, even I'm not sure, when we're talking about restoring, for example, some elephants were released in a very small part of Denmark, which was a cool, fun experiment, but that they have been gone for so long that it's hard to admit. You're not really putting back an ecosystem that we would recognize. Mm-hmm. So for some it will be, even though it's not going to be easy to restore migratory patterns of bison, but at least we have a historical knowledge of how that worked. Mm-hmm. For other species that have disappeared for a long time, it's going to be harder. And that isn't even bringing up, though I am right now, ideas of de-extinction and, say, trying to bring back mammoths or something like that, which is a whole other question.
Yeah, but following up on that, what are the animals in the U.S. that could be rewild and where?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think bison are probably one of the best examples. Another great example, but not without controversy, are wolves, and they were reintroduced to Yellowstone in the 1990s. Almost back of the truck, sort of not under cover of dark white, but they didn't get funding from Congress, and that has been phenomenally successful, right? Controversial again, but there's no reason from a conservation point of view that we couldn't restore mountain lions and wolves to places like New England, right? So they're here historically. they would play a natural role, but you really have to figure out ideas of slow. We've often made these decisions without local stakeholders, and that's the question, is how you get people locally on board before you do this, which isn't always, the conservationists don't always have a great track record for that. So large carnivores, large herbivores, and a lot of other insect and smaller species too.
Got it. Let's see. Let's see this question. So is rewilding enough, or will we also need to dramatically decrease the number of livestock animals? So how do we balance the two?
Yeah, I mean, right now, as you saw on that slide, the livestock takes up an incredible amount of, I think if we look at a map of the United States and you look at how much land is dedicated to either livestock or growing the feed for livestock, it's enormous. Unless we figure out a new way, we're going to have to reduce consumption for livestock. I don't think there's any way around it and to really move that dial. I can't say what it's going to be at this point. Is it going to be an approach towards veganism, which is a great idea? Is it going to be some plant-based proteins that emerge? Personally, if I had to guess, I can't imagine in 100 years from now humans are eating meat the way we do now. I would be shocked, but I'm shocked about things every day, so I could be wrong.
I guess I would agree with that. We won't eat meat as much. What are some key points of disagreement and ongoing debate among conservation biologists today when it comes to goals and means? And I think the member of the audience who asked this question is talking about what's the word that I'm looking for that you just used in your talk? Rewilding.
Rewilding.
Yes.
Yeah, things have changed a lot. I mean, if you look at the Endangered Species Act from the 1970s, people thought that they could stop the direct impacts on animals. So stop killing animals and they'll come back. It seems natural and intuitive, but it doesn't really often work that way, unfortunately. It has worked for some marine mammals, but not all. So the old school idea was stop killing them and they'll come back, and it was really controversial among conservationists in the 1990s, the idea that we would captive breed animals, take them out of the wild, breed them, and put them back. That was bitterly fought over the California condor. Every individual is taken out of the wild. There are now several hundred in the wild. It was the right call. It was a terrible call. But it was still the right call if you wanted to have them around, because just leaving them out there, they weren't going to come back on their own. So that was one battle. And then I think the next was this idea of genetic restoration. So, for example, Florida panthers were also really reduced to several dozen individuals. And what they did is they brought 7 female Texas cougars into Florida. They bred with those. That reduced the inbreeding, and populations are now above 100. So that was another controversy for that time. And I think now, and I think, I believe we're going to get there, is this idea of assisted migration and assisted evolution. Questions of, we're seeing vast amount of coral colonies die. One option is you take them and you freeze them and you release them if and when the situation is better for them, or are you breeding genetically ones that are more tolerant to higher temperatures? That's ongoing, and I think we'll be arguing the idea of, I think genetic technology is I don't know if it's still controversial. It's emerging. The question is, I think we have limited funds. So the most important thing we need to do with the money is protect the habitats and the animals we have, because we can't afford to lose that wildlife, and also be looking at these new technologies. There's controversy over whether we should be spending money on de-extinction, on this idea of genetically resurrecting species. I don't think there's really competition in funding for that. I don't see, that's like a coolness factor to me. People may argue there's a practical reason, but I think it's more because it's a wow factor than it is because we need mammoths to save the planet. So I think that maybe that's like the sort of the next frontier, is that idea of how we're going to alter species genetically. Again, I don't know, a conservationist that's happy with this prospect. But it's sort of like geoengineering, as one of my colleagues said, you know, it's a terrible idea, but it's worse if we don't do it. And sometimes we're faced with that for these animals and plants, unfortunately.
Not much choice. Can humans survive biodiversity loss?
Well, that's a good question. The short answer is I have no idea. But I do think we couldn't. I don't believe we could survive a crash in decline of biodiversity. We are dependent on too many species in ways that we don't know. So my guess is that, you know, the odds would be long that we could survive a biodiversity crisis that gets much worse than it is now. But humans are creative and do all kinds of things that I can't predict. So for me, when I argue about why animals matter, it's the inherent value, it's the spiritual value, it's the cultural value, at least if not more than it is about whether humans depend on them. I've tried that. I've argued about the economic value of animals. I don't think that's what makes us decide what we're going to do. It's because we care. It's because we care about either other humans or other organisms.
Yeah. So in the introduction, I mentioned Guantanamo Bay, and is there a project ongoing? Are you working on it? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote about this with a Navy attorney at JAG about 10 years ago when Obama was president, and I was excited. This was right before the election, and Obama was going to Cuba, was opening up relations, and we were pushing for them to consider. And one of the big conflicts between the two countries is it's Cuban land, and we have a lease on it. And even I've spoken to people in the military all agree, it is Cuban land, it's going to go back eventually, it's a matter of when. So, but it's still not on the table for both countries, or at least not for the United States. So we thought a third path would be, as a transition, converting the land to a peace park. It's an amazing area for wildlife, as often wildlife areas are, because it's restricted access, it's got a fence around it, and the Endangered Species Act and those other laws apply there, so they have to manage it for wildlife in those areas. So I've spoken to folks, to people from the military, as well as conservationists. There is interest. As Mike Leinart, who was in charge of the detention center for a while in the Marines, said, keep this idea out there and wait for the time. I don't see the Trump administration wasn't interested in it. Biden administration to date has not been interested in new Cuban ideas. So it is, as Cubans say, luces largas, or like your high beams. You know, this is one that we're keeping like ready to go. I don't think it's going to happen this year, but I'm interested in anyone. You know, that would be an excellent place for art and architecture and all kinds of things.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering our questions.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
I want to thank the audience for participating and for your questions. You can find videos of this talk and others online, and also information about future Radcliffe public events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you very much for being with us today. Have a great rest of the day.